The sky was black and violent, shredded by walls of rain that swept across the Pacific like battering rams. Towering seas pitched the ship as if it were a toy, waves curling 30, sometimes 50 feet high. Metal screamed under the strain, and inside the bridge of the MV Derbyshire, the crew braced themselves against the sudden tilts, hands gripping rails slick with condensation. The storm wasn't just weather. It was Typhoon Orchid, a swirling monster that seemed intent on swallowing them whole. Out on the decks, massive hatches strained against the pounding seas. The steel giant was bleeding under pressure, and in the hours that followed, she would vanish completely. 44 souls on board. Not one would survive. The MV Derbyshire was a massive British bulk carrier, the pride of the Swan Hunter shipyard when she was launched in 1976. At nearly 300 meters long, she was part of the bridge-class fleet, designed to haul huge quantities of ore across the globe. Her owners, Bibby Line, saw her as a fortress of steel, capable of crossing oceans in almost any weather. By 1980, she had made routine runs from Europe to Asia, carrying cargo from Canadian mines to Japan's industrial ports. It was supposed to be just another voyage when she left Septils, Quebec in July, loaded with 157,000 tons of iron ore concentrate bound for Kawasaki. The ship's crew was a mix of veterans and younger hands, led by Captain John Roberts. At just 46, he was known as steady and capable, with decades at sea. His wife Barbara sailed with him on this trip, as she often did. The other 41 were mostly British seamen, along with 2 apprentices learning the ropes of the merchant service. For weeks, the Derbyshire crossed the Atlantic, then passed through the Panama Canal into the Pacific. By early September, the typhoon season was in full swing. Japanese weather reports tracked Orchid as it gained strength, bearing down across their path toward Okinawa. The Derbyshire was only a few hundred miles away, steaming into the danger zone. On September 9th, the storm closed in. Winds screamed at over 100 miles per hour, and waves climbed higher than 6-story buildings. The Derbyshire battled its way through, but the cargo it carried added a hidden threat. Iron ore concentrate, when exposed to heavy seas, could shift and liquefy. If the hatches leaked or cracked, the ore could turn into a dense, sloshing weight that destabilized the entire ship. Investigators would later argue whether that's what happened. But in those last hours, all the crew could do was hold their course as the typhoon unleashed its fury. Radio silence was expected during storms, so it wasn't unusual that no distress call was heard. For 3 days, families assumed the ship was simply riding it out. Then, nothing. On September 15th, 5 days after last contact, the Derbyshire was officially overdue. Search planes and ships scoured the Pacific waters around Okinawa, finding only floating wreckage. A lifeboat, a few barrels, twisted fragments of steel. No bodies, no life rafts with survivors, no sign of the 44 aboard. The Derbyshire had disappeared into the ocean without a trace. The scale of the loss shocked the maritime world. At the time, she was the largest British ship ever lost at sea. How could a vessel so massive, considered unsinkable by many, simply vanish? Rumors spread quickly. Some suggested catastrophic structural failure. Others pointed to shifting ore cargo. Still others wondered if design flaws in the bridge-class vessels were to blame. For the families, none of it mattered as much as the silence. Wives, children, and parents were left without answers. Only scraps of wreckage returned from the waves. The official inquiry in Britain, launched in 1980, was brief and unsatisfying. With little wreckage to examine and no survivors to question, investigators concluded the ship must have been overwhelmed by the typhoon, her hatches breached by the storm. They did not assign blame. The case was closed. To the grieving families, it felt like a dismissal, a bureaucratic shrug at the cost of 44 lives. Many believed the ship's construction and hatch covers had been flawed, but without evidence, their voices went unheard. For years, the Derbyshire was remembered mostly by those left behind. But questions about her loss never faded, especially as other bulk carriers went down under mysterious circumstances. By the 1990s, concern over the safety of ore carriers mounted worldwide. Families of the Derbyshire's crew pressed for answers, demanding the government re-examine the case. In 1994, the wreck was finally located, nearly 15,400 feet below the surface off Okinawa. What they found shocked even seasoned investigators. The Derbyshire lay broken in two, spread across the seabed for miles. The wreck was astonishingly intact for a ship that had fallen nearly 3 miles. What stood out were the hatch covers, massive steel plates meant to seal the cargo holds. They were missing or torn away, evidence that the storm had ripped them open, allowing water to flood in and overwhelm the ship. One by one, the holds would have filled, dragging the bow under until the ship snapped in half under the immense pressure. The crew would have had almost no time to react. The descent to the ocean floor would have taken only minutes. This discovery forced a new inquiry in 2000. Investigators concluded that the Derbyshire was not lost due to crew error, but because of structural weaknesses in her hatch covers, which failed under typhoon conditions. The design did not account for the massive pressures of green water pounding the deck in succession. The Derbyshire had been doomed not by negligence, but by engineering limits and a failure to imagine just how much punishment a ship could endure. It was vindication for the families, though it came decades too late. The tragedy had consequences beyond the Derbyshire. Bulk carrier design standards were tightened worldwide. Hatch covers were reinforced, and inspections became more rigorous. The loss of 44 lives forced the industry to recognize vulnerabilities that had been ignored. For seafarers, the Derbyshire became a warning etched into maritime history. Even the mightiest vessels could fail under the right conditions, and the ocean never granted second chances. Today, the Derbyshire rests silently in the deep Pacific, a steel grave for its crew and a reminder of the unforgiving power of the sea. For the families, the wreck's discovery at least brought truth, if not comfort. For the shipping world, it became a case study in the dangers of hubris and the limits of design. 44 men and women were lost, carried down in a storm so fierce their ship left barely a trace on the surface. The answers came only with decades of pressure and persistence. And even now, every anniversary of the storm, those who remember wonder what those last minutes were like, when the ocean forced open steel and silence swallowed an entire ship. Thank you for listening to the Sunken Ledger. Subscribe for more true stories from the depths.